In this video, we're going to extend the app that we have here, and we're going to add some additional filters to the form on the right hand side of the page. So currently we can filter the transactions by the type, so that can be income or expense. And what we also want to do now in this video is allow users to filter by the date between a start and end date, and also filter the transactions by the category. And we want to do this with HTMX, so when we submit the form, even with the new fields, we want to update everything on this page, including the totals above, without a page reload. We want to do this all using an AJAX request and using hypermedia and HTMX. So let's get started. Now if we go to VS Code and look at views.py, it's the transactions list view here that we're calling to get that page. And all of those transactions are being filtered using this transaction filter set. So we instantiate the transaction filter and we pass in request.get, and that's the key insight here. Request.get is going to contain any form parameters that are submitted from that form on the front end. So what we need to do is actually go to the filter set, and we need to extend that and add some new fields. So let's open filters.py. Currently we only have one field, it's called transaction type. We want to add new ones for the filtering by date and by category. So we're going to start with the date filter. What I'm going to do underneath the transaction type field is add a new one called start date, and that's going to be equal to a django-filters.date filter, and then we're going to pass some keyword arguments into the date filter. So to start with, we need a field name, and the field name on the original model is the date field. So in order to explain this, I'm going to go to models.py, and the transaction model is what we're working with, and that has a field called date, and that captures the date when the transaction occurred. What we're going to do is extend that date field into two filters, one for the start date and one for the end date. But we need to tell Django filter which field is actually originally on the model, and that's the date field. So that's the purpose of the field name keyword argument. We're also going to pass a lookup expression. Now when we filter and we specify a start date, we only want to get transactions that happened after that start date. So what we're going to do here is pass a lookup expression of greater than or equal to, and that means if we pass a start date of the 1st of May, it's only going to get transactions on that date or after that date. Now we can also give the fields a label for the form that's attached to the filter set. I'm going to use a label here of date from. And finally, we can also pass a widget for the form as well. Now we can use the forms module, but we need to import that at the top. So right at the top here, from Django, I'm going to import the forms module. And for this date filter, when we render the form on the page, I want to use a date input field. And I'm going to pass some attributes to that, and that's a dictionary in Python. And the type of this input, we want to set that to the date type. Now what I'm going to do is basically copy the start date field, and we're going to paste that just below, and we're going to call the field that we're creating here end date. And we're going to keep the same keyword arguments, but we're going to change some of the values. So for example, the lookup expression, rather than greater than or equal to, for the end date, we want to get transactions that are less than or equal to that date. And we're also going to change the label. Instead of date from, it's going to be date to. And I want to do one more thing in this filter set. We're going to add our two new fields into the fields tuple that we have here in the meta class. So let's add the start date, and we're also going to add the end date. So that means that when we have the form in the template, we can now reference these two fields. So what I'm going to do is go to the templates directory, and our form is in this partial called transactions container. So let's open that, and I'm going to search in here for the form class, and we have it here with the HTMX attributes. And within that form, we have a single field at the moment, and that is the field that corresponds to the type filter. What we're going to do now is add our two new filters. So we're going to create two divs here, and let's actually just copy what we have for the transaction type. And I'm going to paste that below here, and we're going to change the field that's being referenced on the form. So instead of transaction type, our field is start date. So we're going to reference that in both the filter add label class line and also the render field line. Now for the label for the start date, we can keep the same classes, but for the actual field itself, the start date field is not going to be a select expression. It's going to be just an input field. So we're going to change the select class to the input class, and that's another component class in 𝗬𝗎cy UI. So I'm going to go to the 𝗬𝗬cy UI documentation, and for a text input, we have, of course, the form control component, but also we have the input component here for an input element. So we're using that here for the start date field. What I'm going to do now is copy these lines of code, and I'm going to go down below here to paste that in. And instead of a start date, let's reference an end date. And we're going to do that in the render field as well. So it's the end date for the second form field. Let's now save this. And we're going to go back to the page, and we're going to refresh this page, and we're going to see a couple of new filters appearing in the form on the right hand side. And because the filtering of transactions and the handling of the form is all handled by the filterset class, what we're going to do here is going to work out of the box. So you can see the most recent transaction is on April 23rd. What I'm going to do is select the 1st of April here as the date from, so that's the start date, and we can leave the end date blank and see if this works. I'm going to click filter, and you can see we get back the two transactions that happen after the 1st of May. And I'm going to put this back to the 1st of March, and we're going to see that this will update from March. If we filter that, we get back an additional transaction that occurred in March. And let's try the end date, and that's got a label of date 2. We're going to select the, let's say the 15th of April. So let's go back to April here, and we're going to select the 15th of April. And we expect to see the April 23rd transaction be removed from this page, but the other two should remain on the page. Let's click filter, and you can see that's what happens. And all of this is happening without a page reload. HTMX is sending the request with the form parameters to the backend, and the backend is processing the submitted data, and it's filtering down the transactions based on that data and returning this partial containing the table to the front end. Now we can combine the date filter with the income type filter. So if we wanted to look at all of our transactions between these two dates, but we only wanted to get back expenses, let's select expense, and we should see that the table updates dynamically, and we get back only the expense between those dates. And if I select a date that's much further back in the past, let's say the 27th of November, when we filter that, we get back a couple of extra expenses. But the important part is that the income filter here and also the date filter, they're both working together to filter down the transactions and return the correct query set to the template, which will then display them to our users. So that's the date filter. We're now going to go back to VS Code and add another one, and that's going to be a category filter. Now, if you look at models.py, the transaction model has a foreign key to the category model. And if we look at the front end, and I'm going to refresh the page to clear the form here, you can see we have multiple potential categories. Now, in the form, a user might want to select multiple categories. They might want to see the expenses or the transactions associated with bills, but also with vacation. So we want to allow the user to select multiple categories here. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to learn how to do that in our filter set. Now, to start with, at the top here, let's import the category model from our models.py file. And if we scroll down just below the end date, we're going to define another field here, and that's going to be called category. And I don't want that with an uppercase. Let's just call the field category. And again, we're going to create a Django filters field here, and it's going to be a model multiple choice filter. Now, the model multiple choice filter takes some keyword arguments. We're going to pass a query set into this, and that's going to be category.objects.all. So when we have a model choice filter or multiple choice filter, we need to tell Django what is the query set of models that we're operating on to display on that form. And we're going to display all of the categories. And secondly, we can select a widget for this, and I'm going to use forms.checkbox_select_multiple. And that's basically going to display the categories as checkboxes, and it's going to allow the user to select multiple of those. So let's copy the category field, and I'm going to add that to the fields that we have in the tuple in the meta class. And now that we have the category in the filter set, we can go back to the HTML template, and below the end date, we're going to add a new field. This is going to be the last field on the form in this video. We're going to give it margin bottom of 4, and we're going to use that form control class from 𝗬𝗎cy UI. And we can close that div out, and then we're going to use the Django widget tweaks render field template tag. So the field that we're going to render is going to be filter.form, and we're going to reference our new field, which is called category, on that form. And because we're using render field, we can add some classes here. I'm going to paste these in. So let's look at the classes that we're adding. Text green 500, so we want the text to appear as a green color, and feel free to change these styles if you want. We're also giving these a border gray of 300, and the checkboxes are going to be rounded And on focus here, we're going to use the ring_green500 class. So let's just see what effect this has had. If we save this file and go back to the page, we're going to refresh the page and we should see some checkboxes appearing, or at least we would if we didn't have an error. Now I don't think I've added a class attribute here, so let's go back, and I can't just paste some text in. We need to add the class attribute to the HTML input element. So let's now save this again and go back to the page. When we refresh the page, this time we can see we have some checkboxes. And because we used this widget here in the category field, and it was the checkbox select multiple widget, this means that we can actually select any number of these checkboxes, and then we can submit that to the server, and it's going to do the filtering in that filter set for us. So here I've selected bills, housing, salary, and social, and the resulting table contains only transactions that have one of those. So this is all working again out of the box using the filter set and using HTMX to send that form data to the server in order to filter down the transactions. Very easy to build up a page like this with these technologies. Let's now move on to testing. So we're going to test the functionality that we've just added to this page. We want to test that all of the filters that we can submit to the backend from this form are going to work as expected. So let's go back to VS Code and we're going to go to test_views.py, and that's within the tests directory here. So let's open that, and I'm going to minimize the terminal for now. Now before we wrote this test here that injected some user transactions as well as the Django test client, we're going to write a similar function now below here, and the function name is test transaction type filter. And that's going to test the type that we have on this transaction filter. That's going to filter down the transactions by either income or expense. So let's start with that one. And a lot of the skeleton is going to be the same here. We're going to get a user from the transactions that have been injected, and we're going to log them into Django with the client.forceLogin function. And after we've done that, we're going to simulate some data coming from the front end. So let's imagine the user has selected a type of income. Let's create a variable called getParams, and that's going to be a dictionary, with a key called type, and the value here is going to be income. So that's simulating the case where the user has selected income on the front end. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to get a response by calling client.get, and again we're going to call the transactions list function. So let's copy this reverse statement. When we reverse transactions list, it's going to give us back the URL for the list page. We're sending a request to that, but we're also going to add some get params here. So let's add that as a second parameter to client.get, and that's going to add the type of income to that URL as a query parameter. Once we've done that, we can get back a query set by looking at response.context, and the context, remember, contains a filter. If we go to views.py, we can see that the context that we're building up here has a filter that's equal to the transaction filter. And remember that a Django filter set, after we've performed the filtering, has a .querySet attribute. So we're going to extract that here and store it in a variable. And what we can do is we can loop over each transaction in the query set. So for transaction in query set, we're going to create an assertion here. We're going to say that transaction.type is equal to income. So in other words, after we send the get request with the type of income as the parameters, what we're going to do is get back the query set in the response, and we're going to make sure that every single transaction in that query set contains a type of income. And we could do something very similar for expenses. So I'm going to copy all of these lines of code and paste them below, and I'm going to change income to expense, and we're going to change the type that's being sent in the get request to expense. And finally, if we go to the for loop, we can also check, or rather we can assert that the transaction.type is equal to expense. So let's go to the terminal now. We're going to stop the Django server, and I'm going to run the pytest command, and that's hopefully going to add these new tests, and it's going to pass the test. Now we've got a problem here, and that's that we have an assertion that's saying that the expense string is equal to an income string. And the problem is actually because I've given the query parameter the wrong name here. I've given it the name type, but if we look at the filter set class, the field name is actually transaction type in the filter set. So let's go back to the tests, and we're going to fix that now. Transaction type should be income, and for the second check, we're going to check that the transaction type is expense. So let's try this again. If we run the pytest command, this time when we run these tests, we can see that they are all passing. Let's now move on and add another test for the start and the end date. I'm going to scroll up here and I'm going to copy these lines of code, and we're going to bring this down into the next function, and we're going to change the name of the function. So what I'm going to call this one is test start end date filter. And again, we need to log in a user in order to test this particular functionality. Now we're going to be working with dates here. So at the top of our test views file, from the Python datetime module, we're going to import the datetime object and also the time delta object. And then let's go back to the bottom here. What I'm going to do is create a start date. So let's create a variable here called start date cutoff, and that's going to be equal to the current date, and we're going to subtract a time delta of 120 days. And then we're going to add some get params as we did before with the transaction type. The field name is start date, and we're going to set that equal to this date that we've got here. So let's paste that in there. And a lot of what we're writing here is going to be similar. So let's copy the client.get statement, and we're going to get back a response here. And in fact, we can copy quite a bit of this. We're going to copy when we extract the query set from the response.context. So we get the query set and then we loop over that. And for each transaction, we want to change the assertion here. We're going to check transaction.date, and we want to make sure, because we've specified a start date, that every transaction in the query set is greater than or equal to, and this should be the start date cutoff that we are checking here. So basically we sent a start date equal to this date here, and when we get back the query set, we want to make sure that every transaction in that query set has a start date that's greater than or equal to that particular cutoff value. So that's the test for the start date functionality. We can do something very similar for the end date. So I'm going to copy all of those lines of code, and I'm going to change the start date cutoff to end date cutoff. And let's change the time delta here. Rather than 120 days, let's just subtract, let's say 20 days here. So the end date cutoff is going to be closer to the current date. And we need to change the get params here to send the end date, and we attach the end date cutoff value here. And this time, when we loop over all of the transactions, we want to make sure that the transactions dates are all less than or equal to the end date cutoff. So we're going to change a couple of values there, but a lot of the logic in this test remains similar. So let's now go to the terminal, and we're going to run the pytest command and test this functionality. And we can see that all tests are passing. It's collected 7 tests and they're all passing. Now we could also add some functionality to make sure that the filter works when you have a start date and an end date, but we're going to skip that just now. We'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer. I want to write one more function here. So we're going to go down below this function, and I'm going to create a function called test category filter. And again, we're logging in the user that's associated with these transactions. Now, in order to test the categories at the top, I'm going to import the category model. So let's do that here. From tracker.models, import category, and then let's go back to the function. And what we're going to do in this function is get the first 2 categories primary keys. So let's create a variable here called category primary keys, and we're going to use the category model in the database, and we're going to call .objects.all, and let's index in and get the first 2 of those, and then we're going to call .valuesList and get the primary key for each of those 2 categories, and we can add flat equals true, and that's going to flatten those primary keys into a single data structure. And once we've got those 2 primary keys, we're going to add them to get params here, and the name of the key is category. That matches what we have in the filter set. That's the model multiple choice filter here. And let's go back to the tests. What we're now going to do, if we go to the top here, is we're going to copy these lines of code. Let's copy all of them and go back down into the function, and we're going to paste these in. So again, we're sending a get request to the transaction list page and attaching the get params with the category. We then get back the query set, and we're going to iterate over each transaction in that query set. And what we're going to do here is change what the assertion is saying. We're going to look at each transaction's category, and we're going to get the primary key for that. And we're going to assert that's in the category primary keys that we extracted here on line 74. So what this is doing here is it's getting a couple of primary keys of categories, it's adding them to the get parameters, and it's sending a request with those to the transaction list endpoint. And that's going to filter down the transactions, and then we iterate over each one of them. And we're then making sure that each transaction that we get back has a category primary key that's equal to one of those. And that's testing that the category filter is working as expected. So let's expand the terminal one more time and run the pytest command. This time we're going to collect 8 items, and as you can see, they're all passing. And before we finish, let's run the server. So in this video, what we've done is we've added a couple of extra filters, a couple of extra fields to the form that we have on this page. And that allows us to filter down the transactions, not only by type, but now also by date, from a start date until an end date, and also by category. And as well as adding that functionality, we've also added some tests using the pytest framework to test that the expected data is in the context after we submit requests with those particular filters. In the next video, we're going to look at giving users the ability to add their own transactions to the database. So for example, if we look at the transactions that we have on this page now, these have all been preloaded by a management command, but we do want to give users who are using this application the ability to add their own transactions and have them displayed on the page, and also be able to filter their own transactions and see the summary statistics for those transactions. We're going to start that in the next video. Thanks again for watching. Give this one a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the content. And if you are enjoying this content, consider buying a coffee for the channel. We have a link in the description that would encourage us to create more content. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.